Welcome to this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Andrew Seidel, a constitutional attorney and the Director of Strategic Response here at FFRF.
I'm Annie-Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker, and Annie-Laurie and I are co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
This week, we're going to be doing a bit of a free-for-all. We have a lot of questions that have built up, a lot from all you viewers, and we're going to go through some of those spare questions that we have. And we also did a special visit here in Madison to kind of solicit a few more questions.
So Andrew, at the beginning of the show, we saw a picture of you wearing your Ask an Atheist shirt out.
Yeah.
That was out at the state capitol?
That was right at the state capitol, yep.
And where you did an Ask an Atheist booth?
We did an Ask an Atheist booth. Me and some of the crew, a couple of the guys downstairs, Chris and Bruce, and we actually went out there and solicited questions from passersby. It was kind of fun. There's actually, as both of you know, at the farmers market, there's always a group of creationists set up there, and we even got a visit from them, though they refused to go on camera to ask a question, probably because we answered all their questions.
The famous Madison, Wisconsin Saturday farmers market, where there's, what, thousands and thousands of people that come by.
I think it's the biggest in the country.
Well, it must be. Now, shall we take one of them?
Yeah, I think we should take one of the questions that we have.
I just want to know, who are you reading these days, and who's your favorite atheist?
Well, I think maybe we should stipulate that it has to be an atheist not in the building.
Oh, really? I was going to say Annie-Laurie was my favorite atheist.
That's very sweet.
Well, because you and your mom were the first knowing atheists that I met on that Oprah Winfrey show, and I read one of your books back in 1984. So
when you were just coming out of
I had just come out of the closet as a minister, and I read your book, Woe to the Women, The Bible Tells Me So. So atheists are real people. They're not just dry authors. They're real people. And now, of course, with Free Thought Radio, I get to read, this is the funnest job in the world. I get to read these books, atheists and scientific writers, and then call them up on the phone and we interview them, which is really nice. I just finished reading Robert Sapolsky's book, Behave, Humans at Their Best and Their Worst. And he's a neurologist talking about how the brain and consciousness and the whole idea of a soul really is all biological. So that's one of the funnest parts of my job.
So, favorite atheist, of course, Dan.
We have to say that, right?
But in terms of authors, I'm going to go to the classics. I'm going to go to Bertrand Russell, who is absolutely my favorite.
Fantastic.
Atheist or agnostic. And his writings, which I started reading in 5th grade, and I've always admired the clarity of how he writes and his wise words in compassion. But from a feminist point of view, I would have to say kind of a tie between Elizabeth Cady Stanton, The Woman's Bible, and also all of her many writings that I got to go in and really get the depth of her writings when I did the anthology Women Without Superstition. Some of her writings I read from manuscript.
Wow.
Really fun, the holograph. And I also greatly admire Margaret Sanger, and so did my mother, we came to the free thought movement through the reproductive rights movement and saw that the real enemy was the church. And Margaret Sanger, very inspiring.
Another great classic is Robert Ingersoll,
Yes.
who still holds up today amazingly. You know, I was just rereading a few of his speeches, and they really hold up well. They're great. But I'm actually reading Steven Pinker right now, Better
one?
Angels of Our Nature,
Okay.
who's going to be at the FFRF convention. You guys should all sign up if you haven't come yet. And then I'm also reading Christopher Hitchens' Letters to a Young Contrarian, which I've read a few times, but it's kind of a favorite.
And he's one of your favorite authors.
He is one of my favorites. And actually, if you're not sure, you know, where you should go for atheist writing, he has a great compendium. It goes back, I don't remember how far. He's got a few that go back really far, these early atheist writings.
Although he doesn't have very many women.
He doesn't, but
if you need women, you can go to Women Without Superstition. That's the failing of a lot of the anthologies.
He has one of the best ones, though, George Eliot's. She takes down a
Evangelist.
Yeah,
that was in Woe. That was in Women Without Superstition.
And that's a remarkable piece of writing.
Clergy are the most irresponsible of all talkers. I remember that line.
That's great.
There's so many, though. Who else are you reading?
Well, then Daniel Dennett has a slew of books, not just on atheism, but on the brain and consciousness. And his most current book is all about the biological basis of what consciousness is. And he's a big current atheist writer.
Well, maybe people can send in their comments about their favorite atheist, I assume, authors we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Share in the comments what are your favorites.
Or come visit the Free Thought Hall library here in our building, where we have, about 3,000 volumes, mostly by atheist and agnostic writers.
Can't be checked out, but you can come and
But
look.
you can come in and browse. Yeah.
And also check out FFRF's shop.
Absolutely.
And we
online.
are always looking for recommendations of other books to carry.
Absolutely. So let's go to our second video question, which I think is a little bit more difficult to answer.
How can you be so sure that there isn't, a universal supreme deity like the Christians say there is, or the Buddhists or the Islamists say that there is?
Just as I would ask someone who believes in God, why are you so sure that there is a God? Why are you, as an atheist, so sure that there isn't?
Dan, do you want to tackle that one first? I feel like you would do that a lot in your debates.
Well, atheism, basically at its core, is an absence of a belief. It's not a belief. Atheism is not a positive philosophy. Atheism is not an epistemology. Atheism isn't even a moral philosophy. Atheism is just the absence of a belief in God. You could ask the same question about how can you be so sure there's no leprechauns, for example? Well, you can't. There's evidence for leprechauns. Have you ever had a box of Lucky Charms and you see this, leprechaun? I mean, there's some evidence, right? But is that evidence for an actual leprechaun, or is it evidence for
Belief in.
or humans' ability to create culture and tell stories and come up with myths and that? So there's the Bible. The Bible is like a box of Lucky Charms. There it is, right? We've got something here, but what is it really telling us? Is it telling us about actual gods or not? So most atheists would say, at least the ones I know, would say that truth is a matter of probability. And even Richard Dawkins, who's probably the leading atheist right now, would say he's most probably sure there is no God. So if you add up the fact that there's a lack of evidence, there's a lack of even a coherent definition, there's a lack of good arguments for a God, there's a lack of agreement among believers about the nature or moral principles of this God, there's a lack of a good answer to the problem of evil, and these holy books are all contradictory and all of that so-called evidence, and then there's no need for a God. People live great lives without it. All of that raises the probability that this God doesn't exist so high that most of us kind of round it off. We say he probably doesn't exist, but come on, let's round it off. And unless you come up with better evidence, we're pretty sure that there's no God.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of our beliefs are based on imperfect knowledge. So it's not really about proof the way they were talking about. It's not we're 100% sure. It's not about proof. It's just about this is the conclusion that I've drawn based on weighing all the evidence and weighing all the arguments.
And also the burden of proof is on the person asserting that there is a God. And,
yeah, exactly.
Bertrand Russell's celestial teapot. How can you prove there isn't this celestial teapot orbiting around? It's this. You can't disprove most assertions of imaginary beings.
Absolutely.
Like if I told you I invented a perpetual motion machine, and you asked me to prove it, and I say, nope, you have to prove that I didn't. Is that the right way to do it? Do I just say you have to prove that I didn't do it? Well, that's how a lot of theists think. If you don't believe in God, you have to prove there's no God. Actually, they have the burden of proof, and in the meantime, we can just withhold judgment and be atheistic, which means without. It doesn't mean anti-theistic. It just means like apolitical or amoral. You just don't have a belief in this God until somebody gives you a good reason.
But from the human point of view, he was saying, how can I be sure there isn't a God? And I think that leads to this idea of Pascal's wager. Gee, wouldn't it be safer for me to avoid going to hell by believing in something that has that threat of hell? What would you respond to that?
Well, that Pascal's wager argument, in whatever form it is, really is not an argument for a God. It's an argument for belief in a God. You better believe because the chances are, right? And if you think about it, it's really ultimately an argument of intimidation. Because if you don't believe, you're going to burn, you're going to suffer. And so any system of thought that has to make its argument by threatening violence, which is what it basically is, it's hell, I want to believe so I won't get punished. Well, that's a morally bankrupt way of thinking.
I'm also not convinced that you can force yourself to believe something that you don't believe. And then also just Pascal's wager, if you're talking about, they're basically making a bet on the odds, and they're saying it's better to believe it because I'll end up in heaven. But that's only assuming that that religion is right. And how many religions are there that condemn you to hell for being wrong?
Exactly. We just believe in one. It's the cliche. Atheists just believe in one fewer God than everybody else. So if you're a Christian, then why won't you be punished by the Muslim God for not believing in the one true religion, and so on?
Yeah. So Pascal's wager is pretty thin, and I really like your part of the answer earlier about the Bible being like the box of Lucky Charms. I feel like that one's going to be a meme.
Did I tell you my Barker's wager to
No.
answer Pascal's wager?
Yeah, please do.
Here's Barker's wager. Suppose there is a God, but he's only going to reward those people who have enough courage not to believe in him. Then by believing...
Because there isn't enough evidence, in other words.
Yeah, so by believing him, you are risking eternal damnation, right? So you're better off not believing in God, right?
Absolutely.
So that's Barker's wager, which is stupid, which is just as stupid as Pascal's wager, right?
Absolutely.
Well, let's move on.
I think we're going to take a question from online now from David Dillon, I believe. So David asks, if you have concluded that there is no God, what was your first premise? So it's a little bit of a hazy question. I'm wondering there if he's asking what about the prime mover argument. Do you think that's what he's getting at? Do you think he's asking for us, what is the prime mover? I'm not sure, but I'll pretend that's what he's asking. So for me, it kind of, the idea is basically, well, the argument goes, everything had to have a cause. That's the rule that David is putting forward. Therefore, God created everything. But they're actually removing God from their initial rule. They're saying that God doesn't actually have to have a cause.
Yes, if everything has to have a cause, then why doesn't God have to have a cause?
Exactly, and if God doesn't have to have a cause, then why does everything have to have a cause? So they get to this infinite regression and they try to cut it off by removing God from the rule that they've imposed in the first place.
And that's called begging the question. Because if you do that, then you are importing your conclusion into your premise to begin with. Mm-hmm. So you may as well not even argue. You may as well just say there's a God. But
Bertrand Russell, to quote him, said that all ontological arguments are based on bad grammar.
Yeah, all those kind of arguments. But I think maybe he might be asking a different
question. So he said, if you've concluded there is no God, what was your first premise?
Well, I think that question itself is kind of incoherent because most atheists would not say, I conclude there is no God. Most atheists say, I don't conclude that there is. Mm-hmm. And in that case, you don't even need a premise. You just have to withhold judgment. You can just be a doubter or a skeptic and not conclude anything at all.
But to get at the heart of what he's asking, I think what he's asking is, why don't you believe in a God? And I think the answer is, I don't think there's enough evidence to.
Yeah.
So I guess if that's a premise, I need some evidence.
So your premise is you're an evidence-based believer, mm-hmm. and you follow the evidence. Mm-hmm. So yeah, if you want to change our conclusion, give us some evidence.
Well, for example, if I concluded there's no such thing as a married bachelor, right? That's a pretty good conclusion, right? Because it's a self-contradictory thing. So in some cases, atheists could argue that by some definitions of a God, not by all of them,
sure,
you can conclude logically that God doesn't exist. For example, I debated an Islamic scholar once who said during the debate, God is all just and God is all merciful. Well, you can't be both. That's like being a married bachelor. To be all just means you're administering sentencing that meets the crime, right? To be merciful means you are administering a lesser sentencing to the crime. You're being merciful. So you can't be all just and all merciful at the same time.
Or omniscient and also compassionate.
Yeah, omnibenevolent.
Omnibenevolent. If you're an omnibenevolent God, then why is there so much misery in the world? If you're omnipotent and you could stop it. So it's self-contradictory.
So you could, by some definitions, you can logically conclude that God doesn't exist, but that doesn't mean you're disproving all possible definitions.
Well, yeah, the self-contradictory God, that's a big problem for believers. So let's go to Tammy Studer's question here. Tammy asks, what is an appropriate response when in a professional setting and you're in a professional setting and someone says, bless you?
Well, Dan has, if I can quote you, will say, if it's a friendly environment, will say, that's a funny thing to say to an atheist. And sometimes people laugh, right?
Yeah, or you can say, thank you for saying that. I understand that you're well-meaning. They don't necessarily mean blessed in the sense of some spirits are going to come down and zap you, you know, like in the movies. They just mean, I wish you well. And if that's what they mean, then we shouldn't take it so hard. It's just an expression, right? When they say
But if you're afraid you're going to lose your job or alienate everybody around you, you may just have to say thank you. But if you're given an option to say something, of course, Gesundheit is German for good health. And a lot of people think it's got something to do with God. You can get away with it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not a problem that we run into in our professional setting
No.
very often, is it?
No.
We actually have a related question from Steve Prosser. I want to ask that now, too. Steve says that trending nowadays is have a blessed day or blessed day. And what is a good response to that? No, thanks. So and this is a big problem if you're in the South. You know, you go to a grocery store and you check out. You hear this from the checkout counter at the bank, things like that. So
Yeah, that's a little disgusting, isn't it? There's something about
passive aggressive,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
What would you say, Dan? We should come up with a quip.
Well, sometimes words can be taken in a more secular sense, but because the word pray, you can be secular, you can pray, which means to ask something of somebody. It doesn't mean you're praying to a God. So maybe you could say, well, the word bless could be like, I'm going to give you a gift. I'm blessing you with this gift in a secular sense. If they're saying bless you in order to try to impose their religion on you, well, then that's aggressive, right?
I think that's the point.
But if they're just saying bless you as a kind of common speech thing, then that's different.
Well, we've touched on this too, but we actually do have a question from Deanna Rhodes.
But I was just going to say, again, you could say, that's a funny thing to say to an atheist. Or you could say, have a secular day. Or
Yeah, you could
come
do
up
that.
with some kind of rejoinder.
And Deanna Rhodes did ask specifically about the sneezes, and you've said you say Gesundheit.
I say Gesundheit.
I say Salud, which is good health in Spanish.
You know, have you ever wondered why sneezing is the only bodily noise people make that needs to have a comment said about? I mean, there's other noises people don't have anything to say when
You cough.
But
when
even
you cough, yeah, or if you burp or something. I mean, why is sneezing suddenly require this? You know?
Well, I probably told you this story already, but my mother was brought up by an Irish American in part who would in jest, when my mother sneezed, say, bless the girl if she isn't a witch. And unfortunately, that has terrible roots, because the thought was that when you sneezed, a demon was coming out of you. So you would bless people so the demon wouldn't come back in, but you would not want to bless a witch.
Oh.
Yeah, so you only bless
So
her
this
if
God
she's
bless
not
you
a
has
witch.
very primitive kinds of origins.
But do you think most people who say that are thinking that witches and demons? They're not. They're just
No, but they're assuming that everybody is religious.
It's a kind of a polite way, you know. I mean, I would never say that to
Yeah.
anybody. And if I'm comfortable enough, I might even go far enough to say, well, I hope not, because whenever God blesses somebody, bad stuff happens, you know. So you could even
Look
go
at
that
Job.
far.
Yeah, I think most people are just unthinking and polite about it. But I think to have a blessed day, I've encountered this before. That to me, that's a little
Grating.
more passive aggressive. Yeah, and it's a little more
Yeah.
deliberate than just.
And also, there was a case where a woman got fired because she was working for a regular company in Indiana, and she kept tacking that on the official thank you, and was told to stop it, and was fired, and she tried to sue over this and did not win. This is customer service, and she was imposing what to many customers seemed to be a religious message.
And it can be very alienating now, with a quarter of the population being non-religious. You don't want to be alienating.
But if you can
quarter
find a
of your
light
customers.
way to deal with it, that's
I mean,
probably the best way.
We could do if you really wanted it to be fun or funny, you could say, and may Allah and may Thor bless you. They might say, well, you know, I'm not a Muslim or I'm not a Viking. And you could say, yeah, that's exactly how it feels for me when you say have a blessed day.
So say something, at least say something friendly or whatever to counter this pervasive religious ideas.
And I think to identify yourself as a non-believer, which is really vital in our society today, because it's why there's so much discrimination against us, because most of us are not out, and religious people have many strange stereotypes about freethinkers.
Yeah, one of the things I always say at the end of any talk I give is the most important thing you can do for the secular movement is to come out of the closet and just be a happy, polite atheist. It's one of the best things you can do to help us.
Do we have another farmer's market question?
We do have another farmer's market question. Let's go ahead and take it.
As a Christian, I believe that this is only a very small part of the actual eternal life that we have coming. So I guess my question would be, are you afraid to die?
How about it?
Well, I almost died. I had eclampsia in childbirth.
Well, technically you did. If I hadn't found you, you were passed out.
Seizing.
That would have been your last memory.
And I remember after that, I was afraid, because I was still very ill in the hospital, and I remember feeling like I needed somebody with me. I made you come and stay with me. I think death is something that we're all afraid of. If you're a reasonable thinking person, why would you not be afraid of death? But in the philosophical sense, I am not afraid of death. I know it's inevitable, and I think that knowing it's inevitable makes this life more precious, and I know that you like to quote Emily Dickinson.
That it never comes again is what makes life so sweet.
And so I think that many believers cheapen life when they say that this is only a small part. You heard him say this is only a small part of my existence. What does that do to his perspective about how important it is what we do in our consequences in this world, and how you want to leave this a better place? And you're not going to get some reward for it. This is its own reward.
It seems like a license to not live life to the fullest, which is...
It seems sad to me.
Very sad, yeah.
But...
And well, from a philosophical standpoint, I mean, I think Mark Twain said something like this. I think Schopenhauer said something like it, where death is going to be just like it was before you were born. You know, it's nothing to be afraid of. And I genuinely can say that I'm not afraid of death, but I really don't want to die. Because
yeah, afraid of dying, not death.
Yeah, and I really love being here. Life is wonderful and it's so much fun. I don't want to go away, but as you say, it's going to happen to everybody. So I think the key is to make the most of it.
Well, that's like the Woody Allen quote, "I'm not afraid of death, I just don't want to be there when it happens."
Well, and your Emily Dickinson quote reminded me of, and it's apropos here, the first paragraph of Dawkins is "Unweaving the Rainbow."
Yeah.
A really great passage, and I think it begins, we are the lucky ones, because we're going to die.
Yeah, because we made it to this point that we got born.
Yeah, everybody ought to go read.
The odds are against it.
Go Google the paragraph real quick. You'll enjoy it.
So more philosophy here. We give greater value to things that are more rare, right?
Scarcity.
Things that are less plentiful. Mm-hmm. Things that are plentiful are cheap, basically. So if life is eternal, then life is cheap. The fact that it is brief and short and precious, that's what makes it special. The fact that we're going to die adds more value to the life we have. And as this questioner was asking, if it's just a small piece of a larger picture, like Annie Laurie said, well, then this little piece is nothing. This is not worth much. So I think we atheists have a greater appreciation for the value and the worth of our lives than those who want to put everything off to an afterlife.
And I also think this is one of the things I would criticize most about religion, that it displaces our interest in reality, in each other, and in our world, and puts all of the focus on some other world, some other time that can't even be proved. And so we're wasting all of our energy and time and money, and look at the money spent on churches and on religion, and worrying about sin and death, or worrying about sin and original sin, and going to confession, and what a displacement of our time and energy and intellect and compassion.
But there is something to be said for, within this life, a long picture, like saving for your retirement. Thinking ahead and planning, but it is going to come to an end.
Or you could give no thought for the morrow, as Jesus.
Yes,
Jesus
which I think is very bad advice.
That's very bad advice. But also, I think this conversation highlights there's this stigma that's attached to atheists, which is that we're these miserable people who hate life.
Or who don't care about death.
And it's exactly the opposite. I think we enjoy it and care about it more because, as Dan said, it's scarce. This is the only shot we've got. We've got to make the most of it.
Well, that's just because we're on camera now. After the show's over, we're all going to go back and wallow in darkness.
I remember being on a talk show in San Francisco and with my mother, and the audience was almost all religious, and they were asking really hostile questions, and one of them was, if somebody dies, do you feel sad? So the dehumanizing of atheists, just because we don't believe in an afterlife doesn't mean that we aren't human and that we hate death, that we hate having people in our family die. Of course, it's brutal, and I think that the sadness of death is one of the main reasons people make up religion.
Well, if they
it's very hard to deal with.
If they believe in life after death, they shouldn't feel sad.
Exactly, it's a contradiction.
They should be happy when somebody dies.
And unfortunately, we have some crazy people who do kill their children and say they're sending them off to a better world.
Before they can sin. There's actually, I don't know if you've seen Ricky Gervais's movie, The Invention of Lying.
Yeah.
And there's a great scene in there where it's a world where nobody can lie except for him. And he invents religion when his mother is dying because he's trying to comfort her.
So I don't want to sound like we're not compassionate about how hard it is to deal with death.
And I think the point that Dan made is right on, too. I mean, we are more compassionate in a sense because this is the only chance versus, they're going to a better place.
We're not going to see our loved ones again. We know that.
I think
it makes it harder.
I think the religious view is a tad more callous, actually, in my mind. So let's go to our next question, which is actually related. We'll do another video question here.
How do you write a sympathy card to a non-believer?
See, again, I think there's an edge to that question. I might be wrong, but it's like, you must not really feel sad about death. And it's true when you go to the card section in stores, dominated by horrible sympathy cards. And of course, what you do is you say, I'm so sorry for your loss, and you reminisce about what you loved about the person who has just died. And, there's nothing hard or there's no secret to it, but hopefully, maybe what she's asking is, do not impose, if possible, your own religious views. I mean, if you say things like he's gone to a better place, or, and it's a child who's died from cancer, ooh, that hurts.
And I think that question was coming from a genuine curiosity, not from a bad place. But I mean, to me, I think it is. Yeah, I'm terribly sorry for your loss. And one thing that we like to do is to offer help. Is there anything you need or anything we can do? Even just bringing food can be, incredibly helpful if you're able. And I think that something concrete like that.
And I think that if you know someone's a non-believer and you send them a sympathy card saying, I'm praying for you, from my point of view, to me, it seems insensitive. Sometimes it almost seems jeering. So that might be helpful for a religious person. It just, who is it? Dennett says, when someone says, I'm praying for you, he says, I forgive you.
I like the I'm thinking for you response is a good one.
Or maybe this questioner is thinking that the best way to offer sympathy is to tell the person that they're going to meet their loved one again someday and that it's not over and you can still have hope, you haven't lost everything. When the reality is you have lost a friend or a relative or somebody dear to you.
Yeah, and I don't think minimizing that loss with religion or myth is helpful. I think it's let them experience that loss and be there for them. That's the key.
But I think that most non-believers are very understanding that many religious relatives will give us sympathy cards, and at least we know the intention is good.
Yes. So we're going to take a question that came in via email. Tessa Ryan asked, how are the Bible and Game of Thrones any different? Both stories seem to be full of violence, incest, rape, and brutality. What makes one a moral story and the other a fantasy?
You're the person who knows this Game of Thrones.
I mean, they are the same. Game of Thrones and the Bible are both fantasies, and they are both brutal books. I mean, she was absolutely right on. And it's kind of one of the reasons, actually, that we thought about adopting the Watchers on the Wall illusion for FFRF's legal
And
team here.
that's your brilliant idea, not we, right?
Well, thank you. And I mean, we are the Watchers on Jefferson's Wall of Separation. So I think Game of Thrones and the Bible are pretty much the same thing.
But the difference is that people don't realize that both are fiction.
Exactly. And there's probably a little bit more magic in the Bible than there is in Game of Thrones, too.
But I think the Game of Thrones actors don't get to deduct their housing allowance on their IRS taxes as clergy. They're just mythical characters, right? They don't warrant the same thing that Christian belief warrants in our country.
And they do have a huge separation of state and church problem in one of the seasons of Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
But they solve it in a much different way than we do here at FFRF.
Now, I'm just in season 1 and haven't watched all of it, but so now I'm wondering, should I, if it's as violent as the Bible?
It's incredibly violent. Well, we have one more question. Oh, actually, we have a couple that have come in over here. So Adam Wright asks, lately I've found myself getting more and more impatient with and less tolerant of religious people. Do you feel that frustration, and how do you handle it? Well, I mean, I think it depends a little bit on the setting. It can be incredibly frustrating when you're dealing with a legal complaint where there's a teacher imposing religion on students in a public school. It can be that, is one of the more frustrating situations that we deal with. But
well, I have to talk about when we were in Chattanooga and going to Dayton, Tennessee to dedicate the Clarence Darrow statue in July that Freedom from Religion Foundation bequeathed to Dayton, Tennessee to counter William Jennings Bryan. I did feel some of that irritation and frustration. I mean, they had read your Bible on the Ray County Courthouse right in front of where our dedication was taking place. And we had to do some fast work to get them to even just agree to flip the sign. And then when I was leaving Chattanooga, I went to a bookstore, and the woman asked me, why I was here. And when I briefly said, oh, I don't believe in evolution. I'm a creationist. Are you an atheist? And I was kind of distraught at that point. I thought, come on.
I think
in the 21st century?
I think if you live with it probably day to day versus us who get to come to work with like-minded people, and most of our lives are spent in the company of other atheists and agnostics, it's probably a lot easier for us. So I think the frustration level's certainly a lot lower.
Well, you were raised in religion. How about you?
So I think it depends on the believer, of course. And most of us non-believers say people should be judged not by their beliefs, but by their actions. So we really shouldn't care if they have all these beliefs that are crazy, if you want to pray to Mother Goose or whatever. But if their actions are causing unnecessary harm, or they're mixing state and church, well then of course we should say something. If they're denying medical care to their children because they're praying for them and these kids die, well there's a moral issue where we should step in. But in many cases I think we can just sort of back off and sort of assume the best about people until they show it otherwise through their actions. Like me, there's a lot of people like me who were raised religious. We were good people, we were strong believers, we cared about
But
blind...
you told me I wouldn't have wanted to sit next to you in a bus.
No, you wouldn't have.
Because you were evangelizing, and I think that this person is irritated by all the gratuitous religion. Our members in the South say they're perpetually asked, do you go to church? What church do you go to? It's very intrusive.
It's one of the first questions you're asked when you
Yeah,
do
so
if you were beside me on the bus and I was giving you this good news of Jesus, which I would have thought was a positive thing, it would have been good if you had said something to counter it. If you would have at least said, I don't believe that, or whatever. And you can sort of gauge the person's psychology and all that. But nobody wants to be ridiculed. In some cases, maybe we should ridicule people and slam the door in their face. But in general, if you want what happened to me to happen to others, we want to sort of embrace them as much as possible as people with good motives until they prove otherwise.
I think that's a very important point. I mean, I think believers have a bad idea, and we often attribute to people who have bad ideas bad intent. And I think that's the mistake you're saying that we ought to avoid, and I'm all for that. So we have one more question. Well, actually, we have two more questions.
Don't we have any farmers market?
Yeah, we're going to close with a farmers market question, I believe. Benito de las Colinas asks, do you think it's important that we offer a positive vision of the world under atheism? One of the problems I find is that people find it hard to leave religious movements because they think they are entering a world of a nihilistic, pointless world without morality. And actually, when I first told one of my family members that I was an atheist, she responded, "So you don't believe in anything?"
Yeah.
And I said, "No, I believe in so many things, love and friendship and all this great stuff. I just don't happen to have this particular belief." And so I think it is important that it's a big misconception that people have about atheists.
Maybe one of our bigger challenges, this idea that religion has a monopoly on art and community and music, and somehow without that, not only would you not have any morals, but you wouldn't have any enrichment. And I mean, Dan, you've done an awful lot of study of the religions of many composers, for example. And what have you?
Yeah, how the world has been enriched
by freethinkers,
by songwriters and
artists,
authors and poets and all sorts of people that have, dedicated their life to a positive purpose. Atheism all by itself, and I think that's part of the problem. Atheism all by itself doesn't offer anything. Atheism is kind of like health. Health doesn't actually offer anything at all. Health is just a state of being where you're free of disease, right? So atheism, you're free of the disease of religion. So if you want to live your life, you have to go beyond atheism into something like feminism or a humanism or a political or social issue or a scientific endeavor or an artistic, something that's positive that even believers do too. We share with them these things. So I think to answer that question, being a good, positive human being, whether you're an atheist or not, is good for the world.
And I think that many secular groups are doing charitable works. As secular people today, we've always done these charitable works, but we haven't identified that as being part of the atheist or free thought movement. So for example, FFRF has created non-belief relief now, but I'm co-administrator of the Women's Medical Fund, abortion rights charity, and have been on the board since the late 70s. It was started by my mother. It's helped more than 22,000 needy women in Wisconsin pay for abortions because there's a cutoff due to religion on Medicaid covering abortions. I mean, we haven't been parroting this, we're doing this as atheists, but most of the board are atheists. And so I think it just doesn't, we're sort of, I hate to say it, but sort of unsung heroes. I think most freethinkers do contribute to charity. They are volunteers, but they haven't done it under one umbrella. And so we're kind of getting smart, and we're starting to do it as a group thing so that we can tell people it isn't just religion. Religion has no monopoly on charity.
Like I remember going to Nashville a few years ago and saw Baptist Hospital, right? Well, there it is right up above, the word Baptist, right? So they're doing their supposedly good work, although you don't get much charity in a Baptist hospital. You pay the same high rates
and
as
also
anyone
they
else.
get huge infusions of federal money.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, a lot of the private religious hospitals are actually giving less charity than some of the others. But in any event, suppose it said atheist hospital, as if atheists were building it so we can promote atheism. You don't see that.
Of course, there are atheists who started hospitals and clinics, and Clara Barton was a freethinker with the Red Cross, Unitarian, creedless person. But I also just didn't like this idea that atheist hospital, you would think I can only go there if I'm an atheist.
Yeah.
Don't we want
does seem exclusionary.
to help everybody?
Yeah, and it's kind of like, why do we have to brag about this? Let's just help human beings. University College in London, the hospital was started by freethinkers. Jeremy Bentham was involved with that. So atheists have built hospitals, although you just don't know it.
And pay taxes toward it, but technically our public hospitals should do the work. We should all be contributing toward those.
And maybe one thing people should go check out if they're curious about this is our Free Thought of the Day on the FFRF website, which has all these luminaries from across the ages who were freethinkers of one stripe or another, and you know their contributions just by looking at their names.
There's thousands, and you go to ffrf.org/day, and you can sort them by name or date, or you can go look up professions to see, well, how many scientists famous scientists were freethinkers, for example. And it's astounding.
It is pretty amazing.
Science world, art world, music world, and of course, progressives and activists.
So we have a question that came in online from Bill Tibbetts. It's a vouchers question, and I wanted to get to it. We're switching gears a little bit here, but it's an interesting question. He says that school vouchers may lead to a disproportionate future increase in Christian and Republican voters as students mature. Is this one of the right's unspoken reasons for pro-voucher advocacy, or one of the left's anti-voucher pushback? I haven't seen this reason used in the public arena. So I actually wanted to mention one of the real unspoken reasons behind vouchers is not to create more Christians and religious right folks, but actually to destroy the public school system.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's not mentioned publicly, and I think we need to do a better job of explaining that to people. Catherine Stewart catalogs this in her book, The Good News Club, and it's pretty clear if you listen to some of the big voucher proponents that what they want to do is eventually destroy the public school systems and force everyone into religious schools.
Catherine just had an op-ed in the New York Times where she was dissing this label, government schools. And that's something that they pound on to make it look like, most public schools are neighborhood schools and we have local control over them. But this makes it look like the government is coming in and dictating all of these things. And, not to allow that. It's a public school. It's open to everybody, but it's not, don't call it a government school. Certainly NEA and all of the other teachers' unions know that the voucher movement is intended to destroy schools.
Absolutely.
I kind of think, and maybe there is something to this question about whether private schools lead to more voters. I don't know. I mean, how would it, Christian families can teach their kids whatever they want, whether they're in public schools or private. But I kind of think this Christian school movement is a little bit of an isolationist thing. Let's get away from the evil influences. It's kind of like Christian flight is kind of like white flight. Let's get out of this, let's have our own little bubble here where we can all just take care of ourselves and teach our kids what we want without the evils of the world coming in.
Well, religion, right, is a closed information system. It can't survive with all this new information about science coming in. Valerie Tarico wrote a great article for Slate on that a while ago, and I think that's also part of the reason for it. So I think we have one more video question, and then we're just going to be about out of time. So let's go to that final video question. And
do you think it's better to raise a child as a Christian or as an atheist?
So you did a whole Ask an Atheist episode on this, on secular parenting, really.
Right. Well, we didn't so much talk about what was wrong with Christianity, but what was right with secular parenting. But as a new parent of two adorable boys, what would you say?
Well, I think there's one thing to be concerned about there's many things to be concerned about, but the one thing in particular that really bothers me is that teaching children to be religious, it doesn't teach them how to think for themselves. It teaches them to accept answers that aren't answers. A second thing that jumps to mind is that it teaches them that they are special, that they are part of this chosen few who are going to heaven just because they believe this thing. And imparting that sort of elitism and saying that everybody else is an other that early on, I think can have some really negative side effects.
As we have seen in Charlottesville.
Yes, absolutely.
So what about you, Dan? You didn't get to talk about that issue.
Well, I think it's better not to raise a child as a Christian or as an atheist, but just as a human being. Even we atheist parents resist indoctrinating our kids with atheism. You have to think like me, because if you don't think like me, well, then that offends me. That's this whole religious mentality.
Yeah, we teach them how to think, not what to think.
Yeah, so, like your mom gave you a Bible when you were a girl. And your brother went to church with his friends, and it's like the atheist parents are, that's cool, you should be exposed to all points of view. So
a little, I think inoculation was what she thought would happen.
Yeah, you get a little bit of the disease, and then you've got built up an immunity to it, maybe.
Or expose you, and you realize, oh my gosh, I don't want to be part of this.
So, or it's like what Dawkins says, there's no such thing as a Christian child or a Muslim child or a Catholic child.
He really points that out quite emphatically in any case he can, that it is wrong to label children by the religion of their parents. But from a practical point of view, we want to bring up children who know how to think, who are free from religion until they're old enough to understand abstractions, and then they can go and discover for themselves.
Make their
but
own
I
decision.
don't think that we should be afraid to let them know what we think. I mean, that would be very I think.
And there might be something to the inoculation too. You know, my mom encouraged me to go to different churches with my Christian friends and to temple with my Jewish friends. It became very clear early on that they were all wrong rather than one of them being right. So yeah, something to think about.
So in either case, take your kids to church sometimes.
So I think we've wrapped up the free-for-all, but what's coming up next week?
So next week we're actually going to discuss why it's important to challenge even the smallest violations of state-church separation, even those things that don't seem that important. In God we trust, on the money, under God in the pledge, and why they actually are incredibly important.
Sweat the small stuff.
Sweat the small stuff. So join us next week for FFRF's Ask an Atheist at the same time on FFRF's channel, 12 o'clock noon Central Time, Wednesdays. See you then.